New Canaan Society. What an honor to be with you all this weekend. You guys are a remarkable group of men. As you now know, my name is Jay. What you likely didn't know is that my middle name is Elmer. This was middle school for me. Elmer Fudd, Elmer's glue. But I have both my grandfather's names. Jay was my dad's father's name, and he died 2 years before I was born. Elmer died when I was in graduate school. And at his funeral, the sadness that I felt was not really about his death, but the reality that I never truly knew him in his life. And so a couple years later, my aging grandmother, Dorothy, moved out to the Seattle area to be closer to my parents. And one thing to know about Dorothy is that she could be a cold steel door when it came to sharing stories or emotions. And so I quickly realized if I want to know anything significant about the life of a grandparent, now would be the time to do it. So in my mind, I came up with a phenomenal grandson gift. I went to an antique store and I bought 3 skeleton keys from the era of my grandmother's birth year. And right around her 90th birthday, I took her out to this cafe, and I said, "Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life." She looked dismayed. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds passed. She looked down at these keys, looked back up at me, and pushed the keys back across the table, saying, "Jay, there are some stories you just don't tell. There are some stories you don't tell, and there are some stories that you need to keep locked up." 2 minutes later, she asked me to take her back to her assisted living home. And this would be our last meaningful conversation. Several years later, Dorothy died, and my parents were going through some medical records and found some truly shocking information. My father grew up believing that he was the firstborn child of Dorothy. But in his medical records, there was actually a box that was asked if Dorothy had any previous births. That box was checked yes. As far as we can piece together, Dorothy was likely raped by a family member sometime around the age of 14 and shipped off from Illinois to Louisiana. You see, the story that my grandmother could not tell was not random. It was a direct reflection of the parts of her life that had known trauma and sexual abuse. The story that she couldn't tell at 14 imprisoned her for over 80 years. I've often wondered a lot since I figured all this out, how my father's life and my own would have unfolded differently had Dorothy had a context to share this devastating story. Our untold stories have lasting consequences for generations. We cannot fathom the compounding interest that evil is earning off of the heartache of our lives. My grandmother is who poet Maya Angelou, as Ian mentioned last night, is referring to when she says, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." If we don't tell our stories, our personalities, and our self-destructive behaviors will do it for us. So this morning, I have been invited to share with you about the stories that we don't want to tell. The simple assumption is that each of us carry stories that we wish we could efface from our lives. This could be an unwanted sexual behavior like a lifelong struggle with pornography, or maybe it was an affair that you had during a very low point in your marriage. But it could also be a trauma from long ago, one that you have deemed just too unspeakable to name. Whenever we get close to sharing a portion of these stories, the severe voice of shame warns us to remain silent. What I want to propose to you all this morning is this counterintuitive, if not radical notion that your untold stories, like my grandmother's, actually contain the keys to the freedom you have been waiting your whole life to find. Therefore, the greatest gift that you could give yourself is to suspend the belief that you know what your untold stories reveal about you, or that revealing them would lead to your demise in the eyes of others. Our brokenness can certainly expose our sin, but far more, it reveals the cracks where the light of God's kindness shines in and draws us into the gentleness of his love. The specific stories that I'm going to talk about this morning involve unwanted sexual behavior. So this could be the use of pornography, infidelity, hookups, buying sex. Essentially, it is any dimension of your sexual life that at the end of the day, you wish was not part of it. What we know about unwanted sexual behavior is that it is everywhere. 1/3 of all marriages in this room will be impacted by infidelity. On one porn site alone, one site in 1 year, the world watched 4.6 billion hours of pornography. That is equal to over 5,000 centuries worth. Additionally, pornography use is now one of the best metrics of cultural attention that we have. If you want to know what people are doing at any given point in time, look no further than porn rates across the country. So one example of this was during the 2017 NBA Finals between the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Golden State Warriors. So there's a point where it's Game 5, first half. Porn use is down about -6% in the Cleveland area. Then, during the third quarter, it becomes really apparent that Cleveland is going to lose Game 5 and therefore the entire NBA Finals. And porn use shoots up 34% to plus 28% above normal. So while unwanted sexual behavior has become dangerously ubiquitous, the primary Christian approach has been to try to contain it through what I call lust management. And you know the story all too well. This is the bounce your eyes, slap a rubber band around your wrist when you're having an inappropriate thought. And if you continue to struggle, to get into some type of accountability and monitoring software. But I think we can all realize that these efforts have failed to provide pathways to the freedom that we desire and deserve. So, as one of my friends said to me recently, he said, "Jay, when I have been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working." And you all know this story, apparently. So I realized unless we radically change this conversation, we are going to continue to consign men and women to a lifetime of futility with this issue, and worse, to bear the burdens of their untold stories. And so I decided to ask about 3,800 men and women to tell me their story. Not just the story of their sexual brokenness, but their whole story. Because I figured if we could get insights from the data, we could then return that data back to them to aid their freedom. And that is exactly what happened. I found a mountain of untold stories longing to be freed, and with them, those that held them. What I can tell you is that there is nothing random about your unique form of sexual brokenness. The specific internet searches that you make and the fantasies that you pursue could be predicted by your untold and therefore unresolved stories. The implication of this is huge. Your sexual brokenness can be a roadmap to healing, not a life sentence to sexual shame. Let me show you how. So a client of mine that I got to know about a year ago His name is Scott. He's a 38-year-old man. He's been married for about 10 years. And he was referred to me due to some anxiety that he was experiencing at work. He works in the investment brokerage field. And his boss began targeting him with regularity, and so he was having near panic attacks at work. A couple weeks into our work together, he shared a really significant struggle with pornography. So during my first couple months of work with Scott, I learned two significant things about him. The first is that he never, ever wanted to be in the investment brokerage field. Like many of us, he needed a job when he graduated from college, and a friend offered him an entry-level position, and he stayed there ever since. But what he quickly realized is that this field was dominated by men who wanted to make aggressive deals with the aim of retiring early. And the longer that he stayed in this job, he realized that his heart was beginning to drift from the things that he cared so much about. And secondly, after the birth of his second child, his wife really became disinterested in sex. And so what he told me is that when she would decline his bids for intimacy, he would feel really rejected and then go down into the basement to watch pornography. And so one of the things that I do when clients like Scott arrive in my office is to actually ask them the specifics of what they search for on the internet. And you can probably imagine that this is the reason why many people avoid therapy. And he said, why are you asking? I'm intrigued. I've never really thought about it. But tell me why you're asking. And so what I told him is that each of us have an arousal template, which is a constellation of images, thoughts, sensations, times of day, and relational archetypes. And every one of those specifics is basically crafted into this cocktail of what arouses us. And so through a lot of shame, what Scott began to open up to was that he wanted to see essentially college students acquiesce to their needs to serve the man in the film. And so one of the fascinating things about my data is that I could actually see how someone's story could shape and predict the specifics of what they put into the internet. And what my data showed about men like Scott who preferred teenagers, college students, a race that suggested to them some level of subservience, a petite body type, was that they had three key drivers in their story: a lack of purpose, high levels of shame, and a very strict father. As you can see, studying our sexual brokenness actually has a lot to teach us if we're willing to pay attention. So one of the things that we see, the writing on the wall, is that men find power over women arousing precisely because it gives them an arena to reestablish power in the midst of a life of difficulty that they're experiencing. This is what Richard Rohr is referring to when he says that the pain that we do not transform, we transmit. Always someone else has to suffer because I don't know how to. And so in therapy, I began to work with Scott on this notion of what if your sexual brokenness could be a roadmap to healing and growth, not a life sentence to a terminal illness. And to do that, I asked him two questions. The first was, tell me about the age of your first exposure or the time in your life that you began to lean on pornography or whatever your unwanted sexual behavior is most significantly. And second, to tell me about a formative trauma or emotionally abusive experience that you went through between the ages of 5 to 15. And so Scott's first exposure to pornography was when he was in 5th grade. There was a descrambler device down in his basement. And if you don't know what a descrambler is, it's basically, it descrambles erotic cable channels so that you don't have to buy or subscribe to them. And what Scott ended up telling me is every night after his parents would go to bed, he would go down into the basement to watch porn and some of the videos that were down in his basement. And he said, Jay, I always wish I had just thrown that descrambler away. But when I asked him who he thought put the descrambler in his basement and who all who else knew about it, he said, I've never thought about it, but totally my dad. Our whole family knew. And so what I want to underscore is that Scott didn't discover pornography. His parents introduced it to him. They set up the high probability that any child with an ounce of curiosity is going to find it. And so the themes that he and his father watched involved barely legal teens, a theme that continued to play out in his life to this day. The second major thing that I asked him about was, tell me about a significant trauma or place of heartache for you. And he came up with a story just like that. And he said, I was 12 years old, and my little brother and I are throwing this miniature football back and forth in the living room. And so Scott takes a throw, his little brother catches it, dives on the couch. His little brother throws it back to him, he dives on the catch, catches it. But meanwhile, his dad is down in the basement hearing all this commotion and says, quiet down. And they keep playing, which is met with an even louder, quiet down. And then Scott said he remembered throwing this perfect spiral, and it went right through the hands of his little brother and hit the lamp right on the end table and knocked it off. And so his father heard all of this commotion, storms upstairs and says, what the hell happened? After he realizes what's going on, he orders Scott down to his knees. And he raises the broken lampshade and he smacks him across the face. You see, when we are in the ruts of our sexual brokenness, the story that is always at the forefront of our mind is our sexual shame and failure. We spend a lifetime praying for the grace and forgiveness for God to just take this away. And yet, your sexual brokenness is one of the most honest dimensions of your life because it reveals the stories about where you have been and where you are. Healing is about seeing your sexual brokenness with curiosity as to what the story is being revealed. But that only happens if we liberate those stories, not conceal them. So in therapy, I began to talk and walk with Scott through this notion that our lust can be one of our greatest teachers, and it's not something that you need to spend a lifetime trying to annihilate. Scott was completely undone between the connection of his father forcing him to his knees in punishment in the ways that he will pursue a fantasy of women being on their knees serving men. Additionally, he realized that power over women was so compelling to him precisely because of the lack of power he felt like he had in his life. And additionally, when he would go into the basement as an adult, this was a clear reenactment of the way that he had learned to use pornography in his parents' home when he was a child. As you can see, attempting to manage Scott's pornography use, which was largely about themes of humiliation and power, without addressing his stories of harm around power and humiliation, would never be effective. So when Christian accountability is aimed at stopping lust, maintaining purity, and yes, even being a godly man, the underlying stories that drove his pornography use were completely overlooked. So I want to be clear that I'm not asking you at this point to draw hard and fast conclusions between your untold stories and your sexual brokenness. I certainly believe that those connections are there, and if you're interested, I know of a breakout to explore more. But maybe as I talked about Scott's story, certain stories from your own life were coming to mind. Those are the ones that I want you to be most curious about. What I can only underscore is that when Scott came in to see me, none of those connections had ever occurred to him, which makes me wonder, how many of you in this room could tell me the stories that formed and sustain your sexual brokenness? Or do you all have many stories that you have concluded are irrelevant to your struggle. Or maybe, like my grandmother, have vowed will never, ever be spoken. In the book of Genesis, those who find themselves in a broken place are met by the curiosity and kindness of God. And I have to believe it's going to be the same way in our life as well. When Adam has just eaten of the fruit that he was commanded not to eat from, God shows up and doesn't say, Adam, bounce your eyes from that next tempting piece of fruit. He says, where are you? What have you done? To Jacob, who has been struggling his entire life with issues of honesty and identity, when the angel of the Lord wrestles him, he doesn't tell Jacob, get an accountability partner, you're a liar. It says, what is your name? And to Hagar, the Egyptian mistress of our patriarch who has just been traumatized by the first family of our faith, the angel of the Lord appears to her where she is likely going to die and asks two of the best questions that any of us could ever ask one another this weekend. And that is, where do you come from? And where are you going? The presence of God in our lives calls forth the stories that we don't want to tell, because he knows that in our honest wrestling, we will come to know just how committed he is to our redemption. So, the next time that you find yourself in a broken story, may you recognize that the God of the universe is not ashamed of you. Instead, his face is turned toward you with kindness. And his arrival is not to reproof you, but to get down on his knees, to offer you his body and blood in the midst of a story that you can only see through the lens of failure. It's only here that we begin to understand that God is not inviting us to lock up the doors of desire within us. Instead, inexplicably, he's given us the keys to his entire kingdom. And he's inviting us to open up all the beauty that we can find on this earth. We simply have no idea the redemption that God has for us within the locked stories of our lives. Thank you.